Hi, it's Lili. Today I'm going to show you how I made my miniature modern flat by hand and from scratch. The whole thing is completely modular because it's for stop motion animation. So in total I have 4 walls and I can remove every single one of them with just a few screws and get access with the camera to shoot the animation from every different angle that I want. So I hope you enjoy this video.
To create this set, I started with a floor plan, defining the width and the length of my floor, where the kitchen is going to be, and also the furniture. I also decided where I want to have the doors and the windows. I made another sketch for the wall that's going to have the bricks on it to define the position and scale of the kitchen cabinets, of the big bookshelf on the wall with the TV, and the surface that I'm going to need to cover with the bricks. The other drawings I've made is for the windows. They are such an important part of the architecture that it's really important to define the right height and width for each windows. Then I've cut some plywood sheets for the walls and the floor. I cut the windows and doors out with a jigsaw. And because it's for stop motion animation, I've also cut some studs because I want the platform to be raised. Then I position my floor on the studs. As you can see, I leave a gap so I can access underneath the platform for the screws underneath the feet of my puppets from each direction. So whatever angle I choose to shoot a scene, I can access underneath from every single side. I line up the board against the stud and use the nail gun to attach them together. And then I start to attach all my walls. I like to use a drill and then a screw so I can attach and remove every wall against the studs. And I keep adding more walls, as you can see the third one here, and I've done the same for the fourth wall as well. So I can really move the set around and shoot from every direction I want because I can easily remove every wall with the screws on either side. Then I start to work on the windows. I took some basilwood 2mm thick and cut it to the right length with my Japanese saw, then super glue it in place. I often use some length that is a bit wider than what I need because then I can go over it with a standing knife and have a nice clean cut so that the wood is completely flush. I also like to use the nail file to make sure everything is nice and smooth. Then I build up the seal underneath the window using a piece of basilwood that is thicker. I probably should have go even thicker than that. Cut it to size, super glue it, and I've decided to add another piece of wood underneath to create a seal that looks wider. Then I move on to the architraves around the windows, just find the side that I need to cut and use one of those little metal miter box, and they are so useful to create a nice clean cut at the right angle. You can eyeball it, but honestly this will give you precision. It's worth the investment. Once I have all the windows done, I place a graphic paper underneath, try to line it up with the opening of my windows, and use a pencil to mark the edge of every window. I moved on to the other walls, doing exactly the same thing with the architrave around the door. Then for the door itself, I use a piece of card, turn the board around and super glue the card at the back of the board. So I have a base and I can build up my door on top of it. So using different thicknesses of basilwood and build it up depending on what kind of design you're going for your door. And if you have some little gaps here and there, don't worry, just use some wood fillers and let it set and sand it down. Now I can apply some white gesso throughout to prime the wood and then 2 coats of acrylic paint. If you use a paintbrush like I do, you're probably going to have the lines showing. So what I did is apply a 3rd coat, this time with a wet sponge. It will blur it and give it a nice texture throughout. Now let's tackle the back wall that have the bricks. I've marked up some lines on my wall, the ground level, each side where the other walls are lining up to, the kitchen cabinets, the surface I need to cover with bricks, and it's always handy to have the other drawings nearby so you can double check that all the line and measurements are correct. Then for the bricks, I decided to go for EVA foam. There's different kind of foam that actually can work for this kind of application. It's worth doing some tests. I've cut a piece that is a bit bigger than what I need for the whole surface. I could have done the tile as well with the foam, but I thought I'm going to try something different this time. To glue the foam, first I apply some contact cement. This stinks like hell, so doing outside or in a well ventilated area. I've applied a coat on the plywood and at the back of the foam. Wait 5 minutes until it stops being tacky and then bond them together. And take your time to do this because once it's bonded, it's going to be hard to remove. And I like to have a piece that is slightly bigger so that once it's completely nice and flat, I can then cut the edges and have a clean line. Then I marked on my bricks with a permanent marker, starting with the horizontal line and then cut the vertical lines in. And then I use a wood burning tool, do it outside or in a well ventilated area and with a mask on and gloves on. And then I burn basically each line horizontally first, and then I cut it vertically to cut the bricks. Then I need to add some texture, so I mix some sand with PVA. My PVA is clear, but any PVA will do, and also any kind of sand will do. Apply it throughout with a brush, and then I remove everything that got into the grooves and let it set completely. Then I can apply a good coat of white gesso to prime it, 2 coats of acrylic paint in reddish tone to create a base, and then it's all about building up with a sponge, adding some red, some orange, some sienna, some brown, until you have a really nice, interesting color combination. Then I seal it with a clear matte sealer and apply a dirty wash. I've used some diluted acrylic paint in this kind of dirty beige color. Apply it throughout and then quickly remove it with a wet paper towel, and make sure you have enough of those wet paper towel on hand to remove it straight away. And once it's completely dry, you can seal it with the clear matte varnish. Now for the tiles, I could have also done it with the EVA foam, but I decided to go a bit more experimental for this one. So you see I have my sketch which defines exactly the size of the tiles. So I cut some piece of basswood to the right dimension to cover the tiling space on that wall. And then I took a mesh. This is actually a thermoplastic mesh that I bought a while back to go experimental on it. I'm not going to use it for the thermoplastic properties, but I just like the texture and the way it's divided. So I thought I'm going to play around with this one. I use my favorite polymer clay, Super Scoopy, pass it through the pasta machine to have a nice flat sheet, place it on top of the basswood, cut the excess, then apply a piece of cling film, position my mesh on top of it, and then roll over it to press the texture onto it. Make sure you hold the mesh so it's not moving around. And then you have a little texture, and I think it looks pretty cool. I think it's nice to play around and try new things. One thing I've discovered during that experiment is when it's uncooked, the clay is literally laying on top of the wood. But once you cook it, let's say for 15-20 minutes, the clay will bond to the wood itself underneath. So that's an interesting discovery. It holds together really nicely after cooking. Then apply 2 coats of paint, use the brush to apply different colors to it. Now let's put the tile on the side for now and focus on the ceiling. Before I was actually painting the brick wall, I cut a piece of plywood to the right size for the ceiling. And I put it in position, tape it in place, and thanks for my camera for going freestyle on this one. Sorry about the blurriness. I went with a pencil all around to mark the line where the walls touch the ceiling. Okay, now the focus is coming back. Great. All right, let's move on. So I had my line all around the ceiling, marking where the wall will touch the ceiling. I've also marked up the worktop that will be underneath, so I know exactly what's happening where, because I need to define the position of my beam and the position of the spotlight as well. So I play around a little bit using some screws, try to define how many spotlight I wanted and also where I wanted the pendant on top of the worktop. Once I was happy with the position of the beam, I marked them up with a pencil and then used some super glue to attach them in place. I also have a little bit of trim, as you see it's at an angle here, and I went all around 3 of the edges, the one that touched the white walls. I didn't add the trim on the wall that is with the brick line because I knew I wanted to have a flush look and the wall going directly into the ceiling without any trim. Then I took some washer to go around each spotlight, and I took some smaller washer to go around the pendant light above the worktop. Then I drilled into my ceiling. I should have marked those lines before I glued the beam because I thought they were lined up, but they weren't. And it's only when I started super gluing my washer that I realized that they were not exactly lined up and it had required some filling later on. But anyway, I had my washers in place. I can prime the whole thing with white gesso and paint it. Then I started to focus on other elements such as skirting and windows. For the skirting, I took different thicknesses of basswood. The first is probably 1 mil and the second one is 2 mil. And I cut them at different width and made sure I sand down the edges so they're lined up nicely and create this look when it's super glued to each other. For the windows, I went back to my graphing paper and started marking up the design and the grills inside of each windows. Once I was happy with the pencil line, I took a permanent marker to mark them up more clearly. Then I used a big sheet of clear plastic and it needs to be bigger than the 3 windows combined. I tip it onto the paper and then use my favorite 3D paint, PBO Sand Relief, to mark all the lines. I took my time to do it and then let it set for at least a few hours, but ideally overnight. Now let's tackle the floor. I went back to my initial plan, marked up all the area covered with kitchen cabinets so I don't have to add some flooring in this area. I divide all my floor plan in width and length to have my central line crossing. And I wasn't sure yet what kind of design I need to do, so you can go into lots of calculation for it. For me, I prefer to use some leftover bits of wood and start playing around. Try to decide what is the right length, what is the right width, how exactly I want to lay out my floor, until I have something that I'm happy with. I knew I wanted to create a nice frame around the pattern so that it will look even better. Then I used some sheet of basswood 1 mil thick and lay them on top of the floor plan just to get an idea of how many I need, and it's better to use a bit more than what you think you need, so you have a bit of extra. First I cut them into the right length. In my case it was 6 centimeters long, and if you have sheets that are 1 millimeter thick you can cut probably 2 at a time. And then I cut it in width. It's worth putting the time to cut them right, because if you have some longer, wider, it's gonna make a mess later on. So ideally work with pieces that are the same size throughout. So I went back to my board. I had all my lines marked up, not just the central line, but also how I'm gonna divide my pattern. The most important line ever is the first one, so it's worth putting the time getting it right. For every single piece of wood, I had to use the nail file to bevel the edges, and yes, I had to do this for every single one of them. Position them in place, mark up with the pencil exactly where they need to go, and then use some super glue to position them in this exact position. Once you have the first one correct, then you can just repeat again and again and again. I also left a little bit of a gap in between each board instead of having them too tight, because I wanted the bevel to show and the pattern overall to stand out. If you're in it for a quick, easy floor, that's not going to be the right design for you. There are other options available out there, but I think it's worth the effort because it looks gorgeous by the end of it. Once I have the whole flooring down, I can cut the edges with a Stanley knife, which give a really nice clean look. Use the nail file to make sure I have a bevel on the edge as well. And then use the same thickness of wood to cut some framing all around it. I cut at the right angle, and I used some pieces that were slightly wider than needed. And as you can see, once I super glue them in position, then I can use the Stanley knife and go all along the edge to have a really nice clean flush line. And there you have it, the floor is assembled. Then I apply 2 coats of acrylic paint, seal it with a clear matte sealer, and then apply a dirty wash. I wish I went even darker for this one, but just apply some diluted acrylic throughout, darker than the color previously used, and then grab some wet paper towel and remove most of it straight away. Don't let it set, and make sure you have enough wet paper towel around you to be able to remove almost all of it straight away. Let it completely dry, and then you can use some clear matte varnish to protect it. Then I start to reassemble my pieces. I had my floor, I had my walls, I had my brick wall. I've started to cut the skirting as well and super glue it in place. Then I turn the board around at the 4th wall, continue gluing the skirting as well on this one. For my kitchen cabinet, I built some very basic blocks with basswood 3 or 4 millimeter thick. As you can see, I have 2 big sheets on the front and the back, and some smaller sheets for the width that I super glued together. 2 of those 3 blocks are pretty much the same. The 3rd one, the bigger one, have a bigger opening at the front because this is where I'm going to have the light feature, so I need enough space to get the micro LEDs, 10 meter long micro LEDs in it, and then the battery pack. Then I can start to build up actually the cabinet on top of those blocks. So I took more sheets of basswood, super glued them on top of each other, had the first layer to separate from the what will be the skirting underneath. Add some cabinet door with some thin piece of basswood, and I make sure I sand and smooth the edges before super glue them in place. I've repeated the whole thing throughout to add all the cabinet doors. I decided where I want my sink to be, and I cut out some wood that was in that position to make sure I had a clean opening and it was just lined up on top of the cabinet door. I smoothed the edges of some basswood to create a net panel. Now to create the light feature, initially I took some basswood and cut 3 openings on top of it. Now if you use some wood, you will need to cut for that kind of design against the grain, and the wood is not gonna like it, and if you look in detail you can see a little hole. It's not looking nice and clean. So what I thought is, if I take some card, I can have a much smoother, cleaner edge. So I use the template, copy it, cut it out, and as you can see the difference with the card is much smoother. So I'm really glad I changed the material to get a better finish. Then I super glue the card into my base. I've also added a side panel that is slightly wider, so it goes further out on each side. Then I super glued this third component to the two others and started working on the worktop. Make sure I have enough orang for the bar area. The basswood I've used is probably 5mm thick for this part. Then I start to position my tiles temporarily to get an idea of how it's going to look, confirming the size of the cabinet that I need to build on top of it. Initially I build up a very basic block, then start to add a front panel, then start to add side panels and cabinet door, and as you can see, it started to look quite nice when you add those little components. At that point I realized I miscalculated the amount of tile I needed because I need the cabinet to be further up. So just to fill the gap, I decided to add a bit of basswood to build up and pretend it was always meant to be that way, and it's going to become part of the worktop as well, so that the cabinets are high enough. I cut the worktop where the sink is going to go, make sure it's lined up with the cabinet door. To create the sink, there's usually a trick I like to use. First, I shape some basswood smaller than the area of the sink. Then use some Worbla, my favorite thermoplastic, warm it up, and then slowly bend it and shape it around the basswood shape. Now, if there's a tear, don't worry and don't panic. You just cut a piece of Worbla, put it back in, blend in it. It will stick to itself. I mean, Worbla is magical in a way that it's almost like a sheet of clay, and you can just do whatever you want with it. I waited until it was completely cold, and then I can remove the basa piece inside of it and cut all the edges. You can also use a nail file to smooth the edges and drill in the middle for the drain. So I had my sink that was a nice fit, and I've super glued all my pieces of the worktop together. I can start tackling the painting. For that, first I used a little bit of wood filler. I see I had some gap here and there, so you just let it dry and sand it down. And then use some white gesso to prime it first, and then a few coats of acrylic paint on top of it. Another element that I still needed to do for those cabinets are the door handle. For that I used some flat wire in white. I cut it to length, smooth the edges on each side with some metal file, and then bend them. If you use one of those jewelry pliers, they are perfect for this kind of job. Now going back to the rest of the room, I needed to do more dirty wash. Now this is rare, but in this instance I used some black wash, which is basically diluted acrylic paint, because the color of the floor is already dark anyway, and remove most of it with a wet paper towel. Usually I use dark brown to do my washes, and there's also another color that I use a lot. It's like a dirty beige kind of. So if you tackle area that are near white or light color, it's probably better to use that. You remove most of it anyway, but you will still have a little bit showing, and this color is plenty enough to use in those spaces. To create the big bookshelf, first I went back to my initial sketch at the right scale and started to build up the frame with basswood that is 3mm thick. Then I cut smaller pieces of basswood and start to build up inside. When you use super glue, it's probably best to put underneath some parchment paper that will avoid the super glue sticking to the table or to the drawing. I used a nail file to make sure the edge will line up nicely, and then prime it with white gesso and paint it. While that was drying, I went back to the worktop. To create this marble effect, I found some images online of marble that I've printed on self-adhesive paper. That makes my life much easier. So I cut it to size and slowly but surely wrapped all the worktop with it. So I was happy with that. I realized because I need to seal it, it's probably going to be easier if I super glue some block of wood underneath, so that it's raised from the table and easier to handle. And then to seal it, I decided, oh, let's try Mod Podge. That was a bad decision, because when I apply it, probably because I applied some thick layer to it, I didn't realize, but it's going to react directly with the paper. So you have some little wrinkle with it, some texture that was clearly not what I wanted to have. And also it started to mess with the ink, because initially when I printed it, it was different shade of black and gray, but definitely not green. And you see how the Mod Podge has messed up and create this kind of greenish look that is not what I was going for. So I was not happy with that. I did a quick test on the side using some leftover wood and the leftover of this adhesive sheet. And then I sprayed it with a glossy varnish. That removed the wrinkle, it made it look cleaner and softer, but what I realized is that the spray was making the paper look more transparent, so you have the yellowish and the color of the wood underneath showing up. And that's not what I was intending. I want to have a white base to have this kind of marble effect showing up. So I decided, okay, let's redo the whole thing from scratch. I remove the previous paper, prime it with white gesso so I have a nice clean white base, and I let it dry overnight so there's no moisture whatsoever the next day to apply the new sheets. And then I went through the whole process again and applied many coats of the gloss varnish to seal it, and I had much better result that way. Now for the light feature underneath the worktop, I had my 3 openings and some plastic sheet. Usually some plastic sheet come with the protective layer, as you can see here. Instead of removing it, I decided to keep it there. That give it a more opaque look, which is what I was going for. So I place it inside of the cabinet against the 3 openings. Then took a thicker piece of basswood, tight enough so that it will stand on its own, and it will separate the cabinet into 2 sections. So I have enough space to put the battery pack at the back and obviously the LEDs at the front. Then I cover the thick piece of basswood with some white plastic. I could have painted it, but just to save time I used the white plastic instead. And then you remember the previous sheets of basswood that I used to create my opening that didn't work out. I used this as a template, super glue it onto a piece of leftover plywood, and then use some nails. And if you're wondering, what am I doing here? Don't worry, it will make sense. Then I took 10 meters of micro LEDs and I went all around the screws to shape the wires of the LEDs, exactly in the shape I needed. When I had only 1 meter of micro LED left, I start to go all around each wire and wrap them tight with each other. That means I can remove my screws, and as you can see, it stands on its own and it's got the exact right shape. Then I went back to my thick board in white that goes inside the cabinet, covered with some decorator's tape, place it against the 3 opening, mark them up with a pencil. Then I can cut them out with the X-Acto blade. Remove the external part of it. That gives me a clear pattern of where I need to put my glue and how I can have my micro LEDs set up exactly where they should be. Then I super glue the opaque plastic onto the 3 opening board. Then place the second board that have the micro LEDs on top of it and just started to test it out. So that was all done. I can position my cabinet back onto the floor, super glue the worktop on top of it. Then I super glue the tile against the wall, and the wall only, not the worktop, because every single wall needs to still be able to be separated. So I need to make sure where I put my super glue. I try my bushel to see how it looks and start to focus back on the windows. By now the 3D paints have set, so I can start attaching them to the wall. I add a tiny piece of super glue on the edges and then press it really nicely onto it. And I use the paper sand relief to mark all the edges and cover the gap. Now I'm going to talk about the pendant line that comes just above the worktop. I've created this little box out of basswood, as you can see, with different thicknesses, and I made sure I had an opening at the bottom of it. I took another piece of this clear plastic which still have the protective layers to make it opaque, and I can slide it into my little box. Finally, a top cover to close the box. I needed to have some tube to be able to pass the micro LEDs from above the ceiling. I found some in my workshop that were so thin. I mean, I can imagine you can use some straw for this kind of work, but I had this one which was just big enough to pass the micro LEDs, so I just cut it to size, 2 of them. Then I made a hole at the top of my little box so I can fit my metal tube in it, and use some super glue to make sure they stay in place. Then I prime and paint the whole thing. Another component I created for the kitchen is the extractor. I worked first with basswood to create my little shape, used the nail file to make sure they were nice and smooth, then use some Worbla. Yes, again, Worbla is just magic and can do everything. Warm it up, press it against my shape. I sometimes like to use wood because it's a nice soft press against the Worbla. Another one I think is really useful is a metal ruler. You will get a really nice clean line into the Worbla when it's still warm. Then I can just cut out the excess, wait until it completely cool down, remove the basswood, then I use a scissor to make sure I have clean edges. Decided to cut the basswood into 2 so I can reuse the piece inside of the Worbla. Use a bit of super glue to hold it there, and then super glue the rest of the extractor to it, and then prime and paint the whole thing. I've started adding more components to my kitchen, such as the electric hob. With just a sheet of basswood, painted it black, super glue it in position, and then I add my little handle, Initially I put the white handle on the oven and later on I went back and put the metal one, so I think it looks better. Now I'm going to talk about the sofa. To create it first, I did a sketch on the right scale to define what's going to be the different components. You have the base that I plan to build on wood, and then you have the cushion, the side one, the bottom one, and the back one. So this is my base with 5mm thick basswood. I've also added some little feet that I've pre-painted. Then I've added some thick fabric on top of it just to create some volume and some softness. Hot glue it in place and cut all the extra. Then I super glued the back panel onto the rest of the structure. For the cushion, I used some leftover packaging material, cut it to size, and used a sanding paper to smooth it up. Then you have all my cushion cuts. Then it's all about covering it with fabric. So I used the hot glue gun and took my time to wrap it up as tight as I can. It looks a bit messy at that stage, but most of it is going to be covered anyway with the cushion on top of it. So for the cushion, I used the hot glue gun and I wrapped each of them up with the fabric. In an ideal world, you will create some lovely cushion cover with a sewing machine for every single one of them. I don't have the patience for that. That's a really great shortcut to create a sofa much quicker. Now it looks a bit too clean, so I went in there with some sanding paper to try to age the fabric a bit, and I also used some sculpting tool. I really want to age this part of the fabric because this is where someone is going to sit, so this part of the sofa will be more aged naturally. Then I use an old makeup palette and basically brush some powder the same way you will do a dirty wash, so try to accentuate some contrast and some depth with the powder instead of the diluted acrylic paint. For other pieces of furniture, such as the coffee table, I used some basswood, painted it white, and then used a piece of thick acrylic sheet on top of it. For the bar stool, I first made a sketch to define exactly the shape and size of everything. I found a little tube of acrylic in my workshop that was a perfect fit into one of the washers, so I thought, okay, I'm going to start working with that and basically assemble different pieces together to create the stool. For the seat itself, I used some basswood, thick, and super glue different components together. Once they were set, I can start working with the nail file. And I've also used a wooden dowel that I wrapped around with some sanding paper. It was easier that way to smooth the curve inwards. So now you can see the different components that I've used, from the little seat in basswood with a different washer, a little tube, and yet more washers. Once everything was super glued, I can prime it and paint it. One last bit I need to create was the spotlight on the ceiling. For that I used some clear wool block that I warmed up with a heat gun, wrapped around some little ball of metal. Used the standing knife all around it when it was still hot, and then when they were completely cold I can remove them and trim the edges. A trick I use to attach them to the ceiling is wrapped up some white tack on top of a pencil, for example, and then I press it gently against my little bulb, so then I can bring it to the super glue and add a tiny bit of it on the edges and then press it gently exactly where it needs to go. That avoid having too much super glue on my fingers. For the pendant light, I used probably 5 meters of micro LEDs. I went from above and passed the micro LEDs through the first hole. Then I passed it through the little tiny straw of my pendant light. Super glue those to the ceiling. Inside of my little box, I add some super glue. Place the part of the plastic that is opaque at the bottom of it. Then I went back to the micro LEDs, wrap it up in a bundle, use a bit of super glue to make sure it holds on the base of my lamp, add a bit more super glue on the side, and then gently press the little box onto it and test it out. And then it's all about adding lots and lots of props, such as the little kettle here. It's made with some washers, with a bit of basswood, more washer, a bit of flat wire. Same for the base as well, more washer, a tiny bit of paper just to fill the gap, and a bit of wire. And same for the top, using some thick wire, cut it and sand it down to have a nice shape, and use the tiniest washer ever underneath. And then you can add lots of other details, such as the switches and socket. That makes such a difference to your room. They're not really complicated to make, so it's worth putting the efforts in those as well. And once you build up with lots of little books, lots of different props here and there, the stories start to come together, and the set is done.
Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Next time I'm going to show you how I made the kids' bedroom in the attic. See you next time. Bye bye.